Coal is the dirtiest of fossil fuels, emitting more pounds of CO2 per BTU produced than both oil and natural gas. While most developed countries have moved away from new coal-fired plants, coal is growing in developing countries, particularly in the Asia-Pacific region, where 6 of the world's 10 largest consumers of coal are located, a concerning fact for advocates of a fast, clean energy transition. Yet, the Asia-Pacific region, along with the continent of Africa and most of Latin America, is ripe for geothermal development due to widely available and shallow geothermal resources. Geothermal is particularly alluring as a replacement for dirtier baseload electricity sources. So, can focused national strategies supporting geothermal development allow developing economies to skip over new fossil fuel power production like coal and natural gas? What would this mean for 2050 climate goals and our ability to address energy poverty while fighting climate change? What steps can stakeholders take in the short term to support geothermal development in developing nations? Let's explore.
Hello, and welcome to this Pivot 2021 session where we're going to talk about geothermal energy in developing nations and the way of geothermal energy as pathway to green baseload for these nations. I have a very esteemed panel here with me, but first kind of introduce myself. My name is Alexander Richter. I'm the editor of Think Geoenergy and the managing director of Iceland Geothermal and the Iceland Renewable Energy Cluster here in Reykjavik, Iceland. With me today, we have a very interesting panel, and I would like to kind of briefly introduce all of them here very briefly, and then go the round for a better introduction and maybe kind of setting the scene for this session. So with us is Judith Ephraim from the Organization of the Eastern Caribbean States Commission. She's a program coordinator at the Sustainable Energy Unit in the Caribbean. We have Christian Gischler from the Inter-American Development Bank. We have Meseret from the United Nations Environmental Program out of Nairobi, and Bruce Cutright, the president of Thermal Energy Partners and also very active in project development in the Caribbean. And with that, I'll just kind of hand very briefly over for maybe putting a little bit more context on you individually and over to Judith.
Thank you, Alex, and good day to everyone. It really is a pleasure to be part of this distinguished panel. As you said, I am Judith Ephraim, the program coordinator for sustainable energy at the OECS Commission, where we are working with our member states. Currently, we have 8 countries who are actively working to put geothermal energy on our national grids. So we're very pleased to be part of this event today.
And over to you, Christian.
Thank you, Alex, and thank you to our colleagues of Pivot for having me this morning. I work for the Inter-American Development Bank in a special group called the Mining, Geothermal, and Hydrocarbon Special Group. And the idea is to promote geothermal and essentially how to combine geothermal as a way to decarbonize heavy industry, the oil and gas industry, how to promote more baseload power, things that basically we'll talk in this panel. So very happy to be this morning with you.
Thank you, Christian. With that, over to Meseret. Meseret.
Thank you, Alex, and thanks for having me today with you and with the panel. And I'm really honored and privileged to be here. My name is Meseret, and I work for the United Nations Environment Program, basically as a regional energy program manager in the whole Africa. Our focus is to really see how the renewable energy can really drive all the catalytic sector, not only for electricity, but the other like agriculture, food, and others, security, and also in the context of using as a baseload for those with hydro, and also for others as primary energy resources for the contribution of socioeconomic development in the continent. Thank you, Alex. Over to you.
Thank you. And then over to you, Bruce.
Thank you, Alex. And as everyone has said, it's a privilege to be here with this august group. I'm Bruce Cutright, CEO of Thermal Energy Partners, and now our new partnership with Schlumberger, which is called Geoframe Energy. We've been active in the Caribbean particularly Judith, the Eastern Caribbean, for about 20 years. The key things that we're looking at is exactly what the topic of this conference is about. How can we help small island governments and larger governments as well avoid the problems that fossil fuels have caused for the more developed nations, and really ease the transition that provides no economic penalty for moving away from the easily accessible fossil fuels to a more independent energy source that provides better security and better reliability. Alex.
Thank you. Like I said, I'm very honored with this distinguished panel here, and I'm actually kind of having written pretty much about all of you in different news pieces over the years. It's definitely great to see, and there's a lot of development. And I guess in all the discussion about geothermal recently, we're talking a lot about technology and development and discussions in the Western world. And I guess a little bit the topic of geothermal energy in the developing world goes a little bit under, unfortunately. And for that matter, kind of your experience and your view on the market right now is I guess probably most important, and maybe making the round a little bit. I mean, you know, in the Caribbean, we've seen a bit of waves up and down in interest and discussions about projects. We've heard some success stories. There are upcoming tenders. There's some less fortunate news of projects, but a very wide kind of discussion going on. So that's very interesting. Kenya, naturally, or in Africa, in Eastern Africa, a lot of things happening, which we maybe don't hear enough about, but very exciting. I mean, just the recent news of Kenyan wanting to double its capacity in geothermal kind of shows also where things are going. I mean, in the Latin America context, definitely in Central America and in South America, even things are picking up. I mean, maybe Christian can touch upon that, and I guess Bruce with his project and the partnership also with an oil services company. So that basically covers a lot of these really interesting discussion points that I would like to engage in this panel today. So maybe kind of briefly from your experience, going maybe briefly through the regions where you see most things happening, and maybe you're starting with Maseret in East Africa, the current focus points in East Africa and geothermal.
Thank you, Alex. Actually, the scenario in Africa is different, where I can put that the fastest growth in geothermal development is currently being undertaken in Africa, especially in Kenya and Ethiopia. Maybe you can say why. Because if you see now, the African countries are now responding to the global and actually to the continental development policy processes, responding to the combination of the adoption of 2015 Paris Agreement climate action. Basically, about 48 countries have already ratified the Paris Agreement out of 54. The Sustainable Development Goals of 7, and also the designation of the United Nations of this, Sustainable Energy for All. And the African Union Agenda 2063 is also all countries, African countries are already just putting together their development agenda of 2063 to harness all Africa energy resources to come up to renewable and environmental friendly energy resources. So due to these facts, you can see that Kenya is really leading now, where it has an installed capacity of about 865 megawatt, but it is actually a new project is now on the pipeline of 83 megawatt is due to be commissioned by Kenyan in August 2021. Not only that, if you go to GDC, the Geothermal Development Company, they have drilled steam equivalent of about 63 megawatt at Meningai site as of today. And the power plant construction of the 105 megawatt is really attracting the IPPs, and also they have in parallel the exploration drilling is currently being undertaken in other fields like Paka and Korosi. This is only in Kenya. Let's go to Ethiopia. I think they have been doing this exploration in many years, but now you can see that the IPP and also the public entity is dramatically that increasing the resource exploration and going to the development. So the Ethiopian Electric Power is currently drilling appraisal and production in Aluto for about 75 megawatt. We have IPPs, the Korbeti Geothermal Limited, they are going to commence drilling in 2021. The Tulumoye also now they are there with about 500 megawatt at a stage of 50 megawatt. And this you can see that it's not only the IPP coming, but also the PPP and others are really coming ahead. The Djibouti one, you can see that active drilling is currently ongoing in Djibouti, in Assal and in Galele Goma, with hope of power project in the coming years. So you can see that all these countries and others like Tanzania and Uganda, not only for power generation, but now they are also focusing on direct use application. As I said in my introduction, now geothermal is not only for power generation or for electricity, driving the agriculture, driving the industry, driving the enterprises. That is where we are really focusing now geothermal to use it. What makes geothermal very attractive in Africa is its modular nature, because we go for decarbonization, democratization, decentralization, where it is a future of Africa if we really want to really get access to all electricity. Maybe if you allow me, I can give why it's happening here, why we are having a huge amount of IPPs now in Africa, because you can see that 10 years ago, when I joined UNEP, there were no, I think maybe one or two private sectors here in Kenya, but you can see now in Djibouti, in Ethiopia, because there is a policy aspects that really coming up, and also the financial parts where there is a technical assistance like the UNEP-ARGEO, the Iceland Ministry of Foreign Affairs, the USAID, JICA, and others are really helping the New Zealand geothermal facility, and others are really helping the technical assistance. Not only that, even the development financial institutions, African Development Bank, World Bank, EIB, the German Development Bank. So these are the issues that are really coming. And the technology aspects also, the progress in geoscience, in drilling, other aspects also are really driving. So there is a lot of hope coming in Africa, where you can see more than, I think, 12, 13, 14 rigs are really currently working. And what makes it attractive is now KenGen is really helping the whole countries of East Africa in doing that. So Alex, that is the future of geothermal is here in Africa. We are endowed with huge geothermal resource, more than 20 gigawatt, but we are focusing the whole Africa for direct use application to really to go green and with green growth and to meet the development of all these policy processes. Thank you, Alex.
Excellent. And then maybe also to confirm that for the audience, you can ask questions, which we will try to get to in the discussions. So please just use the platform that you can use to ask questions. And maybe kind of to highlight a fact here that I probably missed in the beginning, the different differences in the individuals here representing their organizations. Actually, we have a development bank, we have a government or government organization, we have the UN here involved, and we have a developer. So it's actually really interesting aspect to kind of play around. And I guess also based on the discussions we had in the past, the notion of geothermal as a wider opportunity beyond electricity, and actually is also a very interesting aspect. But maybe one of the aspects, kind of like Meseret kind of touched upon that, and that was actually quite interesting, is there's a growing electricity demand, particularly in Eastern Africa. And that is driving a lot of development. So it's not replacing current technology, but it's basically building something new. So in that sense, kind of going directly for renewable energy. And maybe with that to the Caribbean and to the question of, let's say, the current electricity demand or the current electricity generation versus the planning for new capacity. And in a sense, how competitive geothermal is that? And maybe that's then a question to Judith.
Thanks, Alex. I think for us, geothermal has always held a very special part in our hearts in terms of our energy mix. The Caribbean really is almost totally dependent on imported fossil fuels, and this is not sustainable. When we look at the resources available to us, we have quite a bit of renewable energy potential. But I think single-handedly, geothermal has the potential to transform our economic and our energy landscapes. And I think this is the realization that has kept our interest in geothermal, even if over the years, we have not had the success that we would have wanted at the rate that we want. But I think now we are well positioned because geothermal really presents a number of unique benefits or advantages to us. As small islands, we don't have a lot of space when it comes to land. So for a lot of our other renewable energy technologies, we always have competing land interests. But geothermal represents the base load, and because of its small footprint, I think it has always been something that is very special to us and something that we are pursuing. When we have looked at our projections for the future in terms of energy demand, geothermal could meet quite a substantial amount of this demand. In some cases, based on the scientific information that is available, some of those islands actually have more than the local demand. And so there are opportunities even for export in the future when it comes to geothermal. Even going back to our obligations under the UNFCCC and our NDC, nationally determined contributions, geothermal energy is really emphasized. And if we have to meet those goals, we have to really produce some electricity from geothermal. So I think for us, we are putting in the measures that will help us to achieve this. I think we are inspired by regions such as Africa, as Meritus just showed here, because it means that it can be done within the developing island context. And we are working on our policies, we're working on our legislation, we are building our capacity. A lot more of our young persons are going to study geothermal engineering. And we think that together, once these pieces come together, the financing, we have a lot more partners. We are also looking at direct use. We can position geothermal to support both our economic development, also our resilience, and of course, meeting our demands, our growing demands for energy, using a clean source of energy.
And that may be kind of to Bruce then the question. I mean, you're developing in a concrete project in the Caribbean. And I guess from all I remember, it's the electricity demand on the island is less than what you could produce essentially as a potential. Kind of how do you see the current situation for you as a developer in the region?
What Judith said is exactly right, Alex. In fact, every island that we've looked at has more capacity than the current demand or even the projected future demand of those individual islands. So what's really on the doorstep of beginning is creating an inter-island intertie system. So for example, Antigua, Barbuda, they are off the hotspot, the plate boundary, but they're within 30 to 40 miles of St. Kitts and Nevis, Montserrat, other islands that have a huge generating potential. Montserrat, after the eruption in, what was it, 2009, 2010, lost about 2/3 of their population. And so the demand on Montserrat is really quite low. It's only about 3 to 4 megawatts, but yet they have a generating capacity of well above 100 megawatts, as Judith mentioned. So this large capacity and uneven demand throughout the region, that represents both an opportunity to develop the generating capacity and to implement a wide area intertie connection. In Central America, that was one of the big projects a decade ago, was looking at how the Central American countries could be connected and then even out the demand and really promote growth for the entire region. One of the things I think all of us at this conference should keep in mind is that the lending institutions, the senior government officials, we're all aware of the advantages of geothermal energy. And as we sit here today, we're all out there promoting it. But part of the problem is that anything pushed from the top down is looked upon with suspicion. So you really have to start at the very bottom of the whole decision process. You have to gain the trust of the population. You have to gain the trust of the local utility that's been running diesel generators for the last 50 years. You know, why should they do something different? Even if most of those generators are in such poor shape that they only operate about 50 to 60% of the time, partly due to poor maintenance, but partly due to the logistics chain that is necessary to keep fossil fuel generators, whether it's heavy fuel oil, whether it's diesel or any other of the fossil fuels. They take a lot of maintenance, they take training and understanding to make them work right. And so the simplicity of geothermal, particularly binary cycle engines, which are really one of the most efficient generating systems that we have, to convince the existing utility managers that this is a better idea, that's an educational process. And so the four notes I wrote here that I would like to talk about today is the first is education. And that's really at the most basic population level and utility level of wherever these projects need to go. I think the last 2 decades, we've been successful for the senior decision makers, for the senior investors to really understand the utility. But right now, we still have lots of education at the most basic level. And unfortunately, or fortunately, I end up spending an awful lot of my time educating the potential customers of why we're a good idea and how the transition can occur without a major economic disruption to the local government or population. Alex.
Thank you, Bruce. I mean, and with that, Christian, I mean, you have, as part of your development bank activities in the region, I mean, the Caribbean, the whole Latin America, you've done a lot, particularly in the information gathering, the information representation and promoting of geothermal. Maybe kind of like an update on the certain aspects maybe that you have done. Yeah, like Bruce said, some of the educational aspects of geothermal and the works and how you see the region, you know, with regards to geothermal.
Thank you, Alex. And basically, we have done a lot in the last years, and let me tell you a little. The IDB has a new vision, the 2025 vision, and it has 5 pillars. And those 5 pillars are very linked to geothermal. So one is, for example, regional integration. We have 2 areas in Latin America that share a same reservoir for geothermal. One is in Ecuador, one is in Colombia, the other one is in Nicaragua and Honduras. They both share the same reservoir. So potentially we could have 2 binational geothermal projects. We also have the vision of promoting more SMEs. In SMEs, we look at the possibility of promoting geoscience, drilling, services for the drilling, for the erection of plants, as of the driving forces that we see for geothermal. And as Meseret said, not only for power generation, but also for provision of heat, particularly for the agribusiness. So we're into that. We are also looking into gender and equity for the region. Many of these places where we have geothermal power are in indigenous communities. It is hard to get there. Sometimes it's difficult to negotiate with the communities, but we have really good examples in Latin America and abroad. One of those good examples is the Mokai project in New Zealand, where the Maori people basically are co-sponsors of the project. We want to use examples like that to promote geothermal in Latin America, where we have several indigenous communities, particularly in places where the geothermal reservoirs are located. The other area is, of course, climate change. And in climate change, what we can do with geothermal is tremendous. From decarbonization of the coal industry, being really a competitor of coal, a competitor of natural gas. So really taking away those fossil fuel sources of power. And the possibility of, as we said before, low enthalpy for district heating, for agribusiness, and more recently, hydrogen, particularly green hydrogen. And one of the ideas that Bruce and Judith was talking about, the Eastern Caribbean, we're looking at also, looking at the possibility of transforming that excess power into green hydrogen eventually, and eventually using that as a route to export that excess power. And the same goes for the rest of Latin America. Remember that in the past, we were always thinking about the electric market where we wanted to sell that power. And after COVID, we had a shortage in demand in many of Latin American Caribbean countries. So there was no really an additional market where to sell to if you were interconnected, or domestically to produce more power, or the incentive to produce more power. But green hydrogen gives and opens a door, a huge opportunity to really export that excess power, convert that power, and export to Asia and Europe. So very important things to think about. Over to you, Alex.
Thank you. And I mean, this has been a lot of the discussion between many of us, is essentially understanding that, I guess, and that would also kind of play into the developers, is creating additional revenue streams to make projects more independent of, let's say, electricity, only electricity or something else, but creating a different economic model for these projects. Like you said, the idea is to produce something else in times when you cannot sell electricity, or to store electricity or energy in that context, I think is very crucial. And I think in that time, and that element, and maybe also kind of in the context of this conference, is bringing a little bit the discussion on the oil and gas sector into the equation, and the discussions of new technologies and the sudden interest of some of the oil and gas players. I mean, we've been discussing a lot about technology, we're talking about investment, but we're seeing increasingly really interesting projects. I mean, even though they might not be big, for example, in the context of Colombia, where an oil and gas, or an oil company, an oil exploring company, basically set up small power generation units with their operations. It's not a huge step, but it's an important step, highlighting that you can do something with geothermal, even though it attaches to something else. And I guess that's also maybe kind of to discuss with you in that context, is understanding that how is geothermal going to be part of the energy mix? Like, my understanding is it will not be the sole source of an energy mix, but it will always play with the other aspects and the elements. What's your take on that? And I see Bruce is quite eager to jump in.
Yeah, Alex and Christian, you're exactly right. This is the key thing that I think we overlook sometimes. For an effective baseload generating plant, what you really want to do is design for the peak demand. And what that does is that leaves a huge generating capacity that's unused during average or minimum demands on a diurnal basis and also on a seasonal basis. So what Christian alluded to is exactly what we need to be looking at. Geothermal doesn't just have to be a baseload power. Geothermal can also be load following by simply managing the flow from the wells or the flow through the heat exchange systems. So you have excess generating capacity. You can use that to drive the generation of hydrogen. You can use those off-peak capacity to run desalination plants. And the big, huge emphasis that's going on today, we just lost a project 2 weeks ago to General Motors, in which there was lithium recovery from the geothermal brines. The power and the potential profit from the power generation was secondary to the profit that could be made from the lithium recovery from the geothermal brines. General Motors came in and bought that project out from under us. They thought it was a great idea. So this competitive nature of geothermal, in which it brings all these ancillary opportunities, is one thing that I don't think we've emphasized enough. Certainly for independent power producers, it's an opportunity to increase the profitability of a project, but from a pure policy standpoint, it represents a much greater opportunity for economic benefit to the country, to the government where the generating plants are. So Christian, absolutely. Green hydrogen, blue hydrogen. I think we would, there's this controversy of green and blue hydrogen. I think if we're generating hydrogen from green energy, it's going to be very attractive in the marketplace. Alex.
Absolutely. If I may jump in here, the other big factor is innovation. And what you're alluding, Alex, in Colombia is actually innovation. And this is the fifth pillar of the vision of IDB. And if you think about it, we got, or we're starting a conversation in El Salvador, where the government had a discussion with the cryptocurrency, so that the geothermal power in El Salvador could provide the source of energy for the mining of that cryptocurrency. I mean, look at how far this can go. It's unbelievable. And in Colombia, as you said, Alex, we have a phenomenon that has been there for a while. In many oil and gas plants, particularly the ones onshore, you drill, you extract the oil and gas, and once that oil and gas is not there, you are basically left with water. And that water is usually hot water. And that hot water may be even over 100 degrees C. So we're talking about medium, low enthalpy, but it's an incredible amount of power that is there. So we have that in the oil and gas industry, and also in some wells in Mexico, which have been there for a while. So the point is, we can harvest that heat, turn it into electricity, turn it into hydrogen, and from something that was eminently fossil, we can now go from a oil and gas field. Now we can produce green hydrogen. So it's incredible.
Yeah, I mean, there are definitely interesting aspects. I mean, we've been talking about extracting. I mean, people talk in the oil wells basically producing up to 60-70% water. And the idea is really utilizing that. I mean, there are discussions in the Western world, for example, in Canada, but also the notion of the cost of tapping these not used oil wells anymore, and the cost of maintaining it and utilizing the hot water that is there for energy production, which naturally puts then the question is like, what do you do with the energy? Because it's often stranded in areas where you don't need the electricity, and that's the question. Bitcoin mining in some of these aspects has been discussed. But maybe in that context of these oil and gas wells, do we see anything like that in the African context? And maybe that's then a question to Meseret. Do you see any development there?
Yeah, thank you, Alex. Yes, that is true. Exploration for oil and gas is also moving at high speed in many countries in Africa. Like new discoveries are being made regularly, like new frontiers for oil and gas in the geothermal countries, that is including Uganda, Tanzania, coal in Kenya, and in Ethiopia, Somalia, Malawi, Mozambique, and DRC. So these are the new discoveries that they really see the oil and gas aspects. But however, one thing what we should really keeping in mind, and when I just even mentioned in the first intervention, is one of the things what we are really, the African countries are really focusing is on the green growth and how the geothermal energy or the renewable energy is really is enabler and a pathway towards addressing the social, environmental, and economic challenges. That is also the costs of these areas through an integrated approach. One, we need it by, just to provide the equal energy access to countries, not only just but on-grid based electrification, but the decentralization is now the future way of providing energy access to Africa. That is one of the really issues. And this is mostly with the path of a future clean renewable energy development, because the geothermal can really help to leapfrog the dirty fuels of the past and with a future of clean renewable energy. So I think this is now what we are really seeing instead of the oil and gas, and going to green, and also try to see the least cost power development master plan. That is also the energy mix is also happening in that context. If you see now, like Kenya, they have coal, but they are really going to green, to geothermal exploration. And then geothermal is now the least cost power development master plan. It is there. So they are really focusing on that, from the social aspects, from the environmental aspects. Now, the energy and climate change, and all countries going to the Paris Agreement, ratifying it, and going to their national determined contribution is now the main aspects of focusing on these aspects. So if they are not able to use their geothermal resources, are not developed, of course, the countries will be forced to use their fossil fuels to really go for that. So you can see that there are certain countries really going for oil and gas in Africa too. Over to you, thank you.
I mean, maybe that in that context, a question to the developer here. We are seeing a lot of new approaches to development. We see the discussions of new drilling technology that decreases the time needed to drill wells. We see closed loop approaches of deriving energy. In the context of the developing world, how do you see that playing a factor into development plans of private developers, Bruce?
Well, it's sort of been the Titanic hitting the iceberg. All of the petroleum companies have cut their staffs back, have reduced their investment in new exploration, even though, as Meseret said, it's still going on. But the focus is not so much on expanding the petroleum field, but in just trying to hold on to what they have. So, as I mentioned when we first started, we formed an alliance with Schlumberger, which is the largest oil field services company in the world. And the reason we did that was because there was two aspects that the geothermal industry as a whole could improve on. One was the ability to use existing data to really compress the time scale of developing a project from discovery to production. And the other one is reducing the cost of drilling. Well, the technology development that went on in the petroleum industry that led to the shale gas revolution, really starting back about 2008 to 2012, that whole revolution in the ability to drill directional wells, to improve the producing formation through hydrofracking, all of those techniques have not been particularly, well, at the time, were not adopted into the geothermal industry. But what it brought to us was first information. The key to a successful geothermal project is really understanding where you need to drill, how to produce the maximum flow rate and the maximum temperature that you can from that area, and then to translate that into a reliable production of electrical energy. Well, the information the petroleum industry had really unused is what we adopted, figure out how to manipulate it with innovative computer techniques, and then allied ourselves with one of the best drilling technology firms in the world. And that allows us to take, as I think it was Judith you mentioned, or Meseret, the problem with wind and solar is they take a huge amount of land. But you can take a geothermal plant, drill all your production wells from an area as small as 1 or 2 acres, and yet reach out 5,000, 7,000 feet horizontally from where the surface plant is to tap into different fault zones or different high temperature zones to produce power at that one site. So the economics of being able to, in essence, use the subsurface space much more effectively, that was the key breakthrough that the petroleum industry brought to the geothermal industry. Information is key. And one of the innovations is being able to really understand how they gather the information, how to access it, and then how to put it into computer systems that you can really illustrate and make decisions that make economic sense from that information. So we're seeing Schlumberger earlier. Well, yesterday we had speakers from Baker Hughes and from Halliburton. All of these technology companies that have been in the petroleum industry see geothermal as a natural transition. And I gave a talk to the White House Sustainability Officer earlier in the week and described geothermal as the full employment opportunity for the petroleum industry. It's a problem. You can't lay 50,000 people off in an industry and think that it has no economic impact. So if you can transition those skills that they have to producing renewable energy, green energy, then that benefits everybody. Alex.
I mean, and with that, I just wanted to kind of get to the ton of questions that I'm getting here in the background and trying to involve here everyone. But I think here come a few questions that are specific to East Africa or the Caribbean. But I think maybe to keep this relatively general, and the question really is the strategies for international cooperation. And in particular, working on the harmonization of policies and regulatory frameworks. And I guess that is a question. I mean, I know that Meseret can talk about this as well, but maybe the question to Judith as part of like an intergovernmental group, in a sense, how can a region harmonize kind of so it becomes easier for developers or for development? And maybe kind of Judith start, and then maybe Christian can tap a little bit in, because I guess the development banks have also a political role to play in one way or another. Judith.
Thanks, Alex. And Alex, if you just permit me, let me not to belabor the point, but I really like the whole subject about linking geothermal and the oil industry. And I just wanted to bring the dimension, for instance, that is being considered in Guadeloupe. And Guadeloupe is the island in the Caribbean where we have an operating geothermal plant, and there are plans for expansion. But they are looking, for instance, to see how geothermal development might support the transportation sector in the near future. I think we can well recognize that the transportation sector is actually a major consumer. In some islands, it's almost 50% of energy and oil consumption. And now there's this whole move towards e-mobility. And I think we have already looked at supplying the electricity for e-mobility via renewables. This would be the preferred option. And a lot of the discussion has focused on PV, for instance. But Guadeloupe is, for instance, looking to see how their geothermal expansion might support e-mobility in the future. In the case of Dominica, where we have a substantial amount of geothermal resources, quite a bit of potential, they have about 9 sites which could possibly be developed. They're also looking to see how that might support industry. So could geothermal energy support a green or eco-industrial park? I think these are the opportunities that geothermal presents to our region. The Caribbean is an area that is quite attractive for investors. In this COVID pandemic now, we have had to reinvent and re-evaluate our economic activities. How can we develop economies that are not so dependent on tourism? How can we attract investors? And I think if geothermal energy can serve to reduce our energy prices, which are primarily based on oil, then it would allow us to attract a new set of investors that would promote development. But to answer your question in terms of how the regional approach is, I think we have, within the Caribbean, we have really understood the benefits of this. I know East Africa has done quite a phenomenal job, but within our context, each of those islands is so small in terms of their human capacity, for instance, their institutional capacity. No one island would be able to produce all the technical resources that are needed. And so this presents a very ideal opportunity for us to collaborate. And this collaboration has to really extend beyond just discussion. We see it as an opportunity for us to share experiences, for us to coordinate with financial and technical resources. And we've already begun doing this. So for instance, we have had some regional approaches when it comes to capacity building. We are now looking at opportunities for supporting the region in terms of our legislative frameworks because they're similar and because, you know, the scenario would be the same. So we are looking to see how we may partner with the CDB. I know they're also working in association with Christian and the IDB, but looking at all the players in geothermal within the OECS and seeing how we can produce a framework, a coordinating framework that would support the limitations and also address the challenges that are shared challenges for all the OECS and most of the rest of the Caribbean for geothermal. So it's something that we see merit in it because of the economies of scale. We see it as an opportunity for us to really capitalize on the resources that are already available and how we can attract and bundle our situation together so that we can address our problems successfully.
And maybe then, Christian, to you. I mean, I guess from your perspective, I mean, you've been funding some projects. There have been efforts by development banks in the earlier stages of development. What do you see as the best catalysts for development in group of nations like for example in Central America or in the more Latin America and the Caribbean context? What are the most important elements that can or catalysts that could work to help push geothermal?
Well, I mean, evidently, a strong regulatory framework helps a lot. We have worked with several countries in performing a geothermal master plan or a route or a law or a decree to promote geothermal, to have it very clear, like for developers like Bruce, who is the owner of the concession, what is the rights to the land, what to do with the water, the environmental permits, how to develop sound environmental and social impact assessments, how to involve the community, how to involve the indigenous community that I talked before. All those things are super important. If we don't do them, today there is a capacity to stop a project, literally to stop a project. And you can invest millions of dollars in preparation and even drilling, even in the plant, and then you can find your project literally stopped, even if it's geothermal, even if you're producing green power. So this cannot be taken lightly whatsoever. So that from the regulatory part. Now, big enablers, as you know, Alex, is the contingent recovery grants mechanism. That mechanism where basically we provide some form of support to developers. In this case, even like Bruce, we're working with Bruce in Navies. Essentially, we provide a grant to drill. If the drill is successful, then the developer returns that grant to the financial intermediary, in this case, the Caribbean Development Bank, and then that financial entity can produce or can take the money and use it in another project. And in case it's not successful, it becomes a grant. Now, we have been doing that with the Green Climate Fund, with the Clean Technology Fund. KfW has been doing that with funding of the European Union and also from the German government. But we need much more of that. We really need much more of that because that is a big enabler. Even in Kenya, you know, this kind of support has been essential to develop Bulgaria and all the other Kenyan projects and so on. But without it, it's really a big hurdle that we need to lift. So essentially, if we are able to de-risk the drilling phase, and let's say the exploration phase, we are basically competing in equal terms with even solar and wind at the cheapest price. And the proof of that is that the Chilean project of Cerro Pabellón was able to compete in the auctions of a couple of years ago, where the winner was solar and wind at around 2-3 cents kilowatt hour. They were able to compete and enter into the auction because they were able to sink some cost in the first stage, and then in the second stage, stage 1, 2, and 3, and so on, they were able to compete in equal terms. The first stage being the one where mainly the drilling occurs, where you need to build the road to the area and so on. So there are ways to make it more competitive, but this type of funding is crucial. On to you, Alex.
And I guess additional revenue streams that could make the economics of a project different,
of course,
are also then a crucial aspect. And I mean, one of the questions, I mean, and I know we've discussed a lot in the Latin America context, is the valuation of geothermal and its green credentials as part of policy, and understanding that it's not purely on the price per se in auctions, but there also needs to be some kind of bonus element with regards to baseload, the baseload attribute of geothermal. And that's often missing in the discussions, in the evaluation of policies and by governments. And one of the questions basically as part of this conference is also, with regards to building new capacity in the competition, often developing countries kind of go for the cheapest road. And cheap in that context is short-term cheap, without kind of looking into the elements. How does that play a role with regards into the policies and the evaluation? Maybe that's then a question to Meseret here, in a sense of, let's say, Kenya. Kenya is particular, but also in the other countries. I mean, we see Ethiopia could easily go with wind and hydropower projects. And where does geothermal fit in that, in the price aspect?
Thank you very much, Alex. I think it's a very good question. Basically, now the issue of keeping the energy mix is very, very much important, because the diversification of energy resources is really meeting the need or the fastest growth of economy in Africa as a whole. And for that, I think the African countries, particularly the government, has really recognized that energy is an enabler and a critical path to drive the socio-economic development of that continent. In that context now, the countries are really putting together actually all energy resources they have, and also as a regional way of putting an integrated way of energy integration towards sustainable development in the continent. That is what they are looking for. So in that aspect, first countries look at what kind of indigenous resources they have at home, without just looking at, just abroad or next door to the neighbors, in order to secure energy. So the energy security is very important. In that aspect, like Kenya, as you see now, geothermal is, in relation to hydro and other renewable energy resources, is considered to be the least cost option. And where you go to Ethiopia, like they have a hydro, of course, wind and solar in other parts of the country. But now putting all these countries together, they have actually a regional power pools where they are putting all kinds of energy resources together: hydro, wind, solar, and also actually the bioenergy and all other aspects, particularly in this green growth or green economy aspects, and putting them together. And countries are just really going for that kind of development. So where does geothermal play in this role? That, for example, if you see now in Ethiopia, the dynamics of the geothermal using it is its baseload, its availability, and its capacity factor compared to hydro makes geothermal more attractive compared to other resources. And coming to wind and also solar. So basically for Ethiopia, it is geothermal will be considered as a base load. And also not only that, and using it as its modular nature, wherever they can really use geothermal even as hybridization. I can give you a very good example what UNEP is currently doing in Kenya, in Nakuru, where we are just really preparing the hybridized actually clean energy, geothermal and solar to drive climate smart agriculture. This is community-based. We are really bringing the small scale holder farmers, but we are bringing also the technology together and showing that really the modular nature and how geothermal can really play a role in job creation, income generation, and spur economic growth. Alex, you know, Africa is a very young population, and we need job creation, income generation in our country, in our continent. For that, we need geothermal, I think, to play an important role on community-based, where it can grow, you know, put a lot of, you know, actually use of this geothermal energy for that kind of, you know, policy aspect. So when it comes to policy, now we are encouraging, even African countries are really putting together a harmonized policy. A harmonized policy means where all the catalytic sectors, agriculture, industry, and transport, education, come together with energy ministry, that how energy can play a role in all these catalytic sector to drive the sustainable development in that specific country, and also beyond the country in the whole region. So these are the kind of things that we are really looking at. So geothermal is not as a big, you know, as a, you know, in terms of the on-grid, but we are also looking at geothermal at a lower scale. One thing which I want really to put is now the clean captive power generation is also now, it's coming, particularly for small scale commercial and industrial clients. As I mentioned to you, for us now, how energy is driving the economic growth. So the commercial and industrial clients are, if you see here in Kenya also, or in other parts of the country, first of all, the unreliable power supply is really, they are suffering from going to their, you know, market. Second, the high costs. So instead of these now, they are really focusing on clean captive power generation with the use of geothermal, with the use of solar and other renewable energy processes, where they can drive the sustainable economic growth in that continent. So we are seeing it, geothermal also playing a role from the direct use application, from its also power generation, from small scale to the higher scale, and also connected or contributing to the regional integration in terms of the regional power pools. If you see, to go to the East African power pool and South African power pool, you can see that geothermal is along those hydro, wind, and solar that playing a role. But of course, now it has to be taken into consideration, is geothermal or electricity is like a commodity, where countries are also really selling their electricity to secure its neighbor, need of this energy security and others. Over to you, Alex.
I mean, maybe in this context, I mean, this is really good. I mean, I think and I think we've had this discussion before with some of you, but the understanding that geothermal is part of an energy mix. It will not be the sole solution to things. And in the understanding that, and that's basically what Bruce and Christian also mentioned, is the understanding of producing something else at peak load when there are wind coming in or solar coming in, and making really efficient use of the cheapest electricity at hand. And then understanding that you can store energy, be it electricity or then heat, creates an opportunity, I guess, for then geothermal, in those times when there is no peak demand, and at the same time creating additional revenues and value for a nation. And I guess really the economic aspects for the developer and the investor, and at the same time actually for the job creation, particularly after the challenges with this pandemic. I mean, actually the job creation is one of the key drivers, and I think this is where geothermal has a lot to offer. But in the context of the funding, and it's something we wanted to get to a little bit, is the financing of geothermal. And the context is that perceivably, in particular after the financial crash in 2008, it was perceivably easier for developing countries to attract funding for geothermal projects than in the Western world. How would you see that today with regards to the interest that you get from private sector players in the developing country, Christian?
So, Alex, I think that we need to hurry up a little bit because the patience of the donors is, it's reducing a little bit. They are starting to consider geothermal in equal terms as solar and wind. And when we have that situation, it's a bit difficult for us because we are really comparing intermittent technology with a baseload technology, but that requires some drilling and some geoscience before we can actually get the power. So it's not that easy now, but there is something that I really need to say, that there is a way around it. And the way around it is also to present geothermal as an adaptation to climate change technology. And we haven't stressed that point a lot. And we are building this fact, which is basically, as Judith mentioned, there is a geothermal plant in the Eastern Caribbean. There is several plants in Honduras, Salvador, Costa Rica, that are active and operating. And when hurricanes passed in those territories, nothing happened. The geothermal plant existing in Chile exists at 4,000 meters in the driest of possible places on Earth, and nothing happens. In the geothermal plants in the US, they are operating fine. And when we had the extreme heat or the extreme cold in Texas, they were operating fine. When we have floods or we have droughts, this technology is resilient to big storms, is resilient to big weather coming in and destroying a lot of competing infrastructure, wind and solar. And we haven't stressed that point a lot, and we need to do that. And if we do that, then a magic door may open, which is the door to the adaptation of climate change. And there's where we can really go and tap for more funding for this technology.
So essentially, so to summarize a little bit, there's the patience of donors with regards to how long it takes to develop a geothermal project. That's a challenge, right?
Yeah.
The other aspect is that we as an industry need to be better in positioning geothermal, not necessarily against others, but highlighting the values provided by geothermal. Correct?
Exactly. It was always about mitigation, but we never really thought about adaptation. What can a geothermal plant in the Eastern Caribbean, perhaps if I can ask a question to Judith, but what would it mean in terms of resilience? You see, it is a super important fact, and we haven't stressed it too much.
If I could just jump in there, Christian, you've hit the nail. And if you would recall the situation in Dominica after Hurricane Maria, Category 5 hurricane, and immediately after this, Dominica set out its plan in terms of recovery and resilience, and geothermal was very, very prominent there. They have seen what geothermal can offer them in terms of economic development, but in terms of, if we look at the amount of devastation they had in terms of their energy supply, they have already taken measures to make sure that such measures, such conditions no longer happen. They have looked at their plans for the geothermal plant, and they have made them more resilient. They've made some design changes. But I think just overall, they recognize that in terms of resilience and in all its form, economic, social, as well as climate resilience, that geothermal has a strong part to play in there.
And maybe then Bruce, to you.
Can't agree more.
Then maybe Bruce, to you. I mean, we keep talking, we keep touching upon the technology aspects in the context of, also under the theme of this conference, in a sense, and getting the oil and gas sector. How much does, for example, your partnership with an oil field service company, in a sense, help you as a developer maybe to kind of take some of the technical aspects into your development plans and becoming cheaper, faster? I mean, all these aspects.
Exactly. Well, Alex, that's the key thing, cheaper and faster. Obviously, wind and solar are the major competitors for geothermal, and they're both intermittent, but everybody can see the wind blow and the sun shine. And so, as Christian referred to the disaster in Texas that we all lived through, that's an example of very poor policy decisions that purchased or drove the price of power down based on the intermittent sources of wind and solar. Well, when in that what we call the snow apocalypse that hit in February here in Texas, 48% of the generating capacity of the state dropped offline. A lot of that was natural gas because the natural gas was diverted for heating uses. A lot of it was wind, and there was some scheduled downtime, which shouldn't have been downtime. One of the units of the nuclear plant was taken offline. But there was no recognition in the pricing policies that the Electric Reliability Council of Texas set up to provide a premium for reliable, sustainable, green energy. It was all focused on pushing the price of power as low as possible. Well, so you can buy wind and solar very cheaply, but if you focus only on that, then the baseload power sources, whether it's geothermal, natural gas, oil, or coal, if they're only allowed to sell into the market for a very minor portion of time, then those kilowatt hours that they're selling on the small windows of time have to be priced very high. Turn the pricing policies around, buy sustainable, renewable power first, and then put in the intermittent sources on top of that. We did the economic analysis. Right now, the average price of power in Texas is about 12 cents a kilowatt hour. The average price of renewable energy is 5 to 6 cents a kilowatt hour. So if they locked in the baseload power and put wind and solar on top of that, the average delivered price to the customer in Texas would be reduced by 2 cents a kilowatt hour. So all of these things we're talking about, what Christian mentioned, it's the whole idea that there has to be an understanding of the premium that generation methods such as geothermal bring to a utility, to a grid system, and to then manage all of those systems together, the multi-use combinations, wind or solar and geothermal work spectacularly together. If you have an air-cooled geothermal system, it has a lag in the middle of the day when the air temperature is really hot, exactly coinciding with the maximum output of a solar system. So fantastic synergies. I've been arguing now that every coal plant, if they don't want to shut it down, needs to have a geothermal plant next to it to sequester the carbon dioxide that's produced back under into the oil and gas reservoirs that it was produced from. So you know, there are all of these options that we are all aware of, and fortunately groups like Christian's Green Climate Fund, International Development Bank, all these, they're creating policies that reduce the risk or the perceived risk in bringing these types of power to be more commonly adopted. But it's the issue of real risk versus perceived risk. And Alex, back to your question of what do you see as working with petroleum industries, everything that we've done has been able to take data to reduce the time that it takes to go from concept to production, and to do it in a way that is clearly demonstrates a reduction of risk in the overall process for the financial institutions, for the private investors, and for ultimately the utility that's buying the power.
And I think with that, I think we need to pretty much wrap it up. But I think to kind of summarize a little bit some of the aspects, you know, of the latest statements. I think what is very clear is geothermal is a very unique source of energy. It provides not only the opportunity of producing electricity, but it basically, even after it produces electricity, there's enough heat that constitutes a source of energy for different applications. And I think in that combination, really, it is providing something very unique, not just, as I said earlier, with the double revenue aspects, but also in the value to the local economies. and to the energy policies of a country. And I think this is something we need as an industry to ponder in. But I think if the point also with regards to the developing countries, I think there has been great support by the multilaterals, by the development banks to push a green agenda for the developing countries. And there's a big opportunity for geothermal in those countries, given that there's an increasing energy demand. And with putting up new plants, there's an opportunity for choosing geothermal over something else. And here I'm actually fossil fuels. And the question really is how we can push this. So I guess summarizing in a sense here, East Africa seeing great momentum. The Caribbean, we really hope that Bruce will succeed in Nevis, and that the other nation islands will also succeed. And Christian, we can only hope that the donors will continue to support geothermal, and we will naturally do our utmost to kind of highlight the attributes of geothermal. And I think with that, we hand it over to the conference, Jamie and her team, and thank you very much. And thank you, Bruce, Christian, Judith, and Meseret for joining today, and keep up the good work for geothermal in your regions.
Thank you, Alex.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you. Thank you, Alex.
Bye.
Yeah.